So we know that the 7 feasts of the Lord, as described in the Old Testament, are prophetic. They're prophetic of God's plan of redemption through Christ, through the sacrificial death of an innocent lamb on the cross that paid for our sins. We know that Jesus has come to tabernacle with us, to dwell with us, and we know that the feasts of the Lord are actually prophetic of God's plan of redemption. The feast days are also tied to certain calendar dates on the Hebrew calendar. For example, Passover always falls on the 14th day of the first Hebrew month. And the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, always falls on the 10th day of the 7th Hebrew month. We know that Jesus died on Passover, right? And his death, which was prophetic, actually happened on the day that it was prophesied to happen according to the feasts of the Lord, which would have been Nisan 14, or the 14th day of the first Hebrew month. God commanded that the Jews keep the feast days as well as the Sabbath and other holy days on certain days, and these days were to be kept holy or to be kept separate. And the only way to do that, practically speaking, was to have a calendar where you kept track of the months of the year and the days of the month and so on. So God created the sun, moon, and stars on the 4th day, and they were for signs and for seasons, for days and for years. So basically, they were a way of telling time, but not just so we could know, what day it is. It's so we would know what time it was on God's prophetic calendar. This was all about understanding and knowing when certain inflection points would happen on God's calendar. So the sun, moon, and stars were made first for signs. Signs in the heavens are prophetic attention grabbers. You'll remember that the star of Bethlehem appeared in the east, and the wise men saw it, and they followed the star so that they could see the one who was born King of the Jews. The star of Bethlehem was a prophetic sign in the heavens. So the sun, moon, and stars were created for signs, and there's more than one heavenly sign. There's several of them, and another one that we could point to would be the Revelation 12 sign, which appeared in the starry heavens. It was a specific alignment. It appeared over the Feast of Trumpets in 2017. The second reason for the sun, moon, and stars were for seasons. That is not spring, summer, fall, and winter, but the Moedim, the seasons, the holy days, the holy feasts, the 7 feasts of the Lord. It was for calculating when those things would happen, when those feast days would take place. Further on down the line, the sun, moon, and stars were created for days and for years. So the passage of time is inextricably linked to the Moedim, the feasts of the Lord, and to signs in the heavens, which let us know when certain prophetic inflection points are taking place. So back in probably about 2013 or 2014, the blood moon tetrad thing became a thing, and people started looking at the sun, moon, and stars, eclipses, and so on, to see if we were at the end times, if there was some starry indicator that was saying, here we are at the end of days. And then the Revelation 12 sign came on our radar, and there were people, I think Scotty Clark was one, but he wasn't the only one. There were people actually in other parts of the world. In Australia, for example, I don't remember the name of the gentleman, but he also had basically come up with the same thing, that this alignment that's described symbolically in Revelation 12, 1 and 2 is actually depicting an alignment which only happens like once every 7,000 years. So all of a sudden, people became interested not only in looking at the signs in the heavens, the constellations and eclipses and so on, which people are still doing to this very day, but people also became interested in the feasts of the Lord because it looked like this sign appeared over the Feast of Trumpets. in 2017. So as Christians, we know Jesus died on Passover. We know that Passover is very significant as far as the feasts of the Lord go. And so we kind of intuit that the feasts of the Lord are going to play some kind of significant role with regard to the end times. So once we started looking at the feasts of the Lord and kind of diving into them, there's all different ways that people did that. But primarily what happened then is people became curious about calendars. Because once you started looking at feast days and dates on the Hebrew calendar, all of a sudden all kinds of Hebrew calendars started showing up. People were interested now in diving into the calendar system for the Jews, the calendar that they used. And along with that came a multitude of all kinds of calendars, all kinds of them. There was the Enoch calendar. There's the full moon calendar, where instead of the new moon beginning the new month, you had the full moon beginning the new month. There's the Jubilee calendar. There's the Dead Sea calendar. There's the calendar that's connected with signs of the zodiac. There's all kinds of them. And all of a sudden it became very difficult now to know what calendar we're looking for, because these feasts of the Lord are prophetic and they are attached to days or to dates. So if we're going to make a template, which is something that I've done, if we're going to make a template that utilizes the feasts of the Lord, what calendar do we use? That's the tricky part. So people would ask me, Brenda, how do you know that you're using the correct Hebrew calendar? And, I've just sort of gone with what's worked. I didn't have anything solid to say to people like, this is the reason why I believe I'm using the correct calendar. But as I've been doing my Bible study on the Passover prophecy, I've already done a couple of Bible studies on the Day of Atonement prophecies and the Feast of Tabernacles prophecies, all the prophecies that are sort of encapsulated in those feasts. I've been working on the Passover prophecies. And in the process of doing that, I all of a sudden had this aha moment where I realized I think we can know what calendar to use. A lot of people have written to me or left comments about Dr. Ken Johnson and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Essene calendar. And basically that goes back to about 1947. There was a shepherd boy in Israel who was just out there throwing rocks to while away some time, I'm assuming. And one rock went into a hole, into a cave, and he heard the sound of breaking pottery. Goes to investigate, and lo and behold, inside of these ancient pots were some very, very old scrolls that we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. Many, many, many scrolls in these pots. And one of the scrolls that was in one of these pots was the Dead Sea Calendar. That's what it's called. And so Dr. Ken Johnson has done a lot of studies, extensive work on the Dead Sea Scrolls and on the Dead Sea Calendar. And I'm just going to read to you an article from the Library of Congress on the Dead Sea Scrolls. A significant feature of the community, that is the Qumran community. This is a group of very religious Jewish people who were living in this part of Israel at the time. They're called the Essenes, and a significant feature of this community was its calendar, which was based on a solar system of 364 days. Now, this is just me talking now. The Gregorian calendar has 365 and 0.25 whatever days, and this calendar here has 364 days, so it's really close to the calendar that we use today. But there were some differences too. Continuing to read now in the article, unlike the common Jewish lunar calendar, which consisted of 354 days. So the calendar played a weighty role in the schism of the community from the rest of Judaism, as the festivals and fast days of the group were ordinary working days for the mainstream community and vice versa. So, okay, this is me talking now. The Qumran community would have feast days that fell on actual different days. from what was the prevailing Jewish mainstream calendar of the day. And so days that were Sabbath days for the Essene community would just be regular working days for other Jewish people. And the same thing held true with their feast days. Back to the article again. According to the calendar, the new year always began on a Wednesday. Okay, and I think it was the first Wednesday after the equinox, but I could be wrong on that. The reason they did this was because it was the day on which God created the heavenly bodies. The year consisted of 52 weeks divided into 4 seasons of 13 weeks each, and the festivals consistently fell on the same day of the week. Okay, so that's the end of that article. For the Essenes, the calendar year began on Wednesday, and this placed Passover on a Tuesday every single year. You could count on it that Passover would be on a Tuesday. Unlike the current Jewish lunisolar calendar, where Passover can fall on any day of the week, for the Essenes, Passover would always be on Tuesday. Okay? Every feast day would take place on the same day of the week every year. In many ways, when just practically speaking, if you're looking at it from the outside, it looked like a perfect calendar. It really was sort of beautifully done. Very, very practical, very consistent, and just, it's really perfect in so many ways. And modern scholars such as Dr. Ken Johnson have investigated the Dead Sea Calendar extensively. And in his book, The Ancient Dead Sea Scroll Calendar, Dr. Johnson presents the idea that the Dead Sea Scrolls actually reveal the correct Jewish calendar. So the following is an excerpt from the synopsis of his book, and it's taken from the book's audio website. The ancient Dead Sea Scrolls speak about a mysterious 364-day solar calendar used by the ancients from the time of creation to about 170 BC. In the 2nd century BC, it was replaced with a lunar calendar by corrupt Jewish priests. Today, we know this corrupt lunar calendar as the modern Jewish calendar. In this book, we will learn about God's original solar calendar and discover what prophecies it reveals. Most Christians know that Jewish festivals teach prophecy. Learn about these prophetic festivals and how to start using the original calendar God gave us. So this is the synopsis of the book that was placed on a website, and in the notes I'll leave you the link to that website so you can see that synopsis, and if you want to listen to the audio of the book, you can do that. And Dr. Ken Johnson, along with other scholars, believe that the current Jewish calendar, which has remained basically the same since 170 BC, is actually incorrect. That for about 200 years prior to the birth of Christ up through now, the Jewish calendar has not been right. It's been wrong. If you believe that the calendar that's been in use since the 2nd century BC is incorrect, then what you believe is that the lunisolar calendar that was in use in Jesus' day, the calendar which was authorized by corrupt priests and Jewish leaders who made up the Sanhedrin, you believe that that was an error too. And this dispute over the calendar was one of the reasons why the Qumran community separated themselves from mainstream Judaism. The Essenes believed that their solar calendar was the real biblical calendar. And even today, some Christians, like Dr. Johnson, believe that the Dead Sea calendar may be the real biblical calendar as well. Okay, so this begs the question, and it's the one that I asked when I was in the process of doing my work on the Passover prophecies. And here's the question. Were the 1st century religious leaders actually using the wrong calendar? That's the question. Were they using the wrong calendar? So is God's calendar the lunisolar calendar used by the Jews, who controlled the temple in the first century? Or is the correct calendar the one that the deeply religious Essene community used? That is the Dead Sea calendar, which was that 364-day calendar where the beginning of the year always fell on Wednesday and Passover always fell on Tuesday. Here's two questions that I think will help us find the answer to whether or not the Jews of the first century were using the correct calendar. And if they were using the correct calendar, and it's the calendar that's still in existence to this very day, then we may be using the correct calendar too, if we're using the traditional Jewish calendar. So let's ask these two questions and see if we can find the answers to them, because I think this will really help us in understanding the correct calendar. So the first question is the question that came to my mind, and that is, was Jesus crucified on the right Passover? Okay, was Jesus crucified on the right Passover? And the second question is, who has the authority to determine the Hebrew calendar and thus when the feast will be observed? Okay, so question one, was Jesus crucified on the true biblical Passover? And question two, who has the authority to determine when that is? Let's look at the first question first. According to the biblical record, Jesus was crucified on Passover. Jesus knew he would be delivered up and crucified on the feast of Passover. Matthew 26:1. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." Jesus knew when the day of Passover was going to fall. And in fact, he told his disciples at one point in time that in 2 days it would be the feast of Passover. We also know that the day that Jesus died, there were tremendous, phenomenal signs in the heavens. And remember that passage in Genesis that talked about the sun, moon, and stars are for signs. So one of the signs that happened was that the sky was black, the sun turned dark for 3 hours. That was a phenomenal and very frightening sign for the people who were watching the things that were happening, the crucifixion and so on. There was also great earthquakes and other things that happened. What this sort of tells me is that God was in alignment with whatever Passover day had been determined by the people who had the authority to do that in the first century. I want to look at a passage in Scripture, Matthew 27, verses 45 to 54. And this actually describes some of the things that were going on during the time that Jesus was crucified. And remember, Jesus said that after 2 days here, the Passover was coming and he would be delivered up to be crucified. Now, from about the 6th hour, there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," that is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders hearing it said, "This man is calling for Elijah." And one of them at once ran and took a sponge and filled it with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain in the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom. And the earth shook, and the rocks were split, and the tombs also were opened. And many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. And when the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." So it would appear that the signs in the heavens, as well as the earthquake, as well as the sign of the veil in the temple being split from top to the bottom, would indicate that this was the correct Passover, that the Passover that was being celebrated or being observed by the religious Jews in Jesus' day was the Passover that God had authorized. So Jesus died on the Passover that was observed by the Jewish religious leaders, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the scribes of Jesus' day, and not on the Passover observed by the Qumran community. Okay, he didn't die on a Tuesday, and he didn't die on the Passover that the Essenes celebrated. Jesus died on the Passover that was determined by the religious leaders of his day using what some would call the corrupt Jewish calendar. Okay, but wait. Why would God use their corrupt calendar? Why would he do that? Weren't these religious leaders, weren't they corrupt? Weren't they wicked and evil men? So why would God use their corrupt calendar, or so-called corrupt calendar? Many of the religious leaders were corrupt, and the high priest Caiaphas certainly was. Nevertheless, these wicked, evil religious leaders possessed the God-given authority to certify the religious calendar. No one else at that time had the authority to change the way the temple and the rituals that are associated with the temple system operated. No one had the authority to change that except for the Son of God, who didn't do that. Okay, he didn't do that. He threw out the money changers and he did some other things. He declared himself Lord of the Sabbath and basically placed himself above the operating or the rules that were associated with the Sabbath day. But he did not cancel out or abrogate whatever authority the Jewish priests had at the time. So why would God allow these wolves to be in charge of his house and his feast days? The answer lies in the way that God has chosen to operate his creation through the principles of delegated authority, stewardship, and his own sovereignty. So in the beginning, God gave man dominion over the earth, and we read about that in Genesis 1:26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." Naming the animals was the first delegated task entrusted to Adam. Adam had the God-given authority to name each animal as he deemed best. Whatever Adam called the animal, that was its name. God did not micromanage this task. God made the animals, he brought the animals to Adam, and Adam named them. Genesis 2:19. Now out of the ground the Lord God had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. Though naming the animals may seem like a relatively minor task in the grand scheme of things, it hints at God's larger plan for mankind, that we as God's delegated agents would exercise dominion over his creation as though God himself were at work through us. It's delegated authority. Our dominion over the earth was delegated to us by God. So whenever God delegates responsibility or authority to his created beings, no matter who's the responsible party or what kind of responsibility they hold, the responsibility is accompanied by the authority to make decisions on God's behalf and the resources needed to execute the task at hand. And of course, we're sort of looking at a perfect situation here, which after Adam fell, things changed a little bit. But the fall of man did not change God's plan for man to exercise dominion. God did not retract Adam's authority or his dominion over the earth. He still had dominion, but his job was going to be made a lot more difficult. Though Adam was still the de facto ruler of the earth, his dominion would be full of sorrow and effort, thorns and thistles and sweat and labor and broken relationships, and death would transform his dominion from this honor that was bestowed on him by God to something akin to a curse. Okay, it's by the sweat of your brow, and it's through pain and childbirth. These are things that are difficult, and that man's dominion would have to be exercised through adversity. Instead of man ruling under a kind and benevolent king, which he was designed to rule under God, now Satan sort of interjected himself between man and God, and Satan became the acting God of this world, okay, usurping God's position of authority over men. So even though Satan insinuated himself between God and man in this divine organizational flow chart, God is still sovereign. Okay, that's the thing, God is still sovereign. God is still the Most High. He's the one who is above all. Satan has to obey God. He has boundaries that he cannot go over. And God can still use Satan in the world, and he still does. And even though Adam ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, even though he sinned, God didn't take away man's authority to have dominion over the earth. Okay, that still belongs to mankind. So let's take a look at the tabernacle of Moses and the feast days, because that's an important part of what we're talking about today. When God delivered the children of Israel from their bondage in Egypt, he chose Israel out of all the nations to be his particular people. Romans 9:4, Paul talks about this. They are the Israelites. To them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. When God wanted to communicate what he was going to be doing as far as the redemption of mankind, he gave all of that information to the nation of Israel, and included the temple, the priesthood, the covenants, the feast days. All of that was entrusted to Israel. Furthermore, God bestowed on Aaron and his sons the honor of ministering to him personally. God chose Aaron. Aaron didn't choose to do this himself. Aaron didn't presume to take this privilege upon himself. Hebrews 5:1-4. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of man in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weaknesses. Because of this, he's obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And as no one takes the honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So Israel was chosen from among the nations to carry the promises of God and so on. And Aaron was chosen out of Israel to be God's personal minister, to intercede between Israel and God. And it was not an honor that Aaron chose for himself. God appointed him to that. 1 Chronicles 23:13. Aaron and his descendants were set apart forever to consecrate the most holy things, to burn incense before the Lord, to minister before him, and to pronounce blessings in his name. So it was Aaron and his descendants who could take this position of being priests. All right. So the most important feast, at least from the vantage point of Israel, was the Day of Atonement. Okay, that was the day that the sins of the nation would be wiped away for the year. And if the high priest performed their duties correctly on that one day, and it was the only day of the year that a mortal man could actually come into God's presence without dying, okay, then the sins of the nation would be covered over or atoned for. They'd be forgiven for that year. And if the priest entered the Holy of Holies on any other day, then they would die. Okay, so which day was the correct Day of Atonement? Was it the day that the Jewish leaders said it was? Or was it the day, for example, that the Essenes said it was, that the correct day would be found on the Dead Sea calendar? Leviticus 16, verse 2 and 29 through 32. This has to do with, there is one day when you can come into my presence. And the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron your brother not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat that is on the ark, so that he may not die. For I will appear in the cloud over the mercy seat. And it shall be a statute to you forever, that in the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall afflict yourselves and shall do no work, either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. For on this day, the 7th month and the 10th day, atonement shall be made for you to cleanse you. You shall be clean before the Lord from all your sins. It is a Sabbath of solemn rest to you, and you shall afflict yourselves. It's a statute forever. And the priest who is anointed and consecrated as priest in his father's place shall make atonement, wearing the holy linen garments. The priest who is consecrated, who is wearing the garments, on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the Day of Atonement, that was the person who could actually appear before God and not die. So we can be sure that the high priest would be very careful to correctly calculate the timing of the new moons and the feast days, because they had a personal investment. After all, they would be the ones who would die if they got the date wrong. So the priests were assigned the stewardship of God's house. They were assigned the stewardship of all the rituals that went with the temple. This necessarily included the calendar, which allowed for the priests to calculate on which day the feasts would fall, and in particular, the feast day that he was most involved with, which would be the Day of Atonement on the 10th day of the 7th month. So let's talk about stewardship now. Israel was the steward of the oracles of God and all of that. And the priests and the Levites, the sons of Aaron in particular, had the stewardship of all things that had to do with the priest going behind the veil to minister to God. He necessarily was very invested in the correct calendar. The stewardship of that day sort of belonged to him. What does it mean to be given a stewardship? Okay, so Adam was given the stewardship of the Garden of Eden. He was given the stewardship of naming the animals. Mankind is given the stewardship of the earth. Here's a quote from gotquestions.org. The biblical doctrine of stewardship defines a man's relationship to God. It identifies God as the owner of everything, including the earth, and man as the manager. God makes man his co-worker in administering all aspects of our life. In essence, stewardship defines our purpose in this world as assigned to us by God himself. It is our divinely given opportunity to join with God in his worldwide and eternal redemptive movement. Okay, so that's the end of that quote from that article. So stewardship defines our purpose in this world as assigned by God himself. The priests had a stewardship over the temple, the ceremonies, and the feast days. They were the ones who were tasked with the preservation of the oracles of God. God assigned this to the nation of Israel, and more specifically to the priests and the Levites. In the book of Leviticus, God gave specific instructions to the priests and Levites, spelling out how and when various feasts would be observed. In essence, the stewardship of the calendar was under the domain of the priest. Stewards can be faithful or they can be unfaithful. Priests could be faithful or they could be unfaithful. God reserved the right to replace unfaithful stewards, or to keep them in place for his own purposes. And here's something that I want you to really understand here. It's a point that I want to make. I think it's very, very important. That God's sovereignty also transcends man's choices. That is, that God will sovereignly work man's choices or how we do our stewardship into his plan. So let's take a look at a couple passages that talk about that. Isaiah 46:10. I declare the end from the beginning, and from ancient times what is still to come. I say, my purpose will stand, and all my good pleasure I will accomplish. Proverbs 19:21. Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of God that will stand. So in the first century, just as during the time of Aaron and his sons, hundreds of years before that, the high priest of Israel was the steward of God's holy days. It mattered not whether the priest was righteous or wicked. God acknowledged and honored the position that they held. And this is something that people in the military, if you have somebody who's over you in the military and they're awful people, it doesn't matter what you think about that person. You salute the uniform and not the person wearing the uniform. You honor the position that they hold, not necessarily the person who holds that position. It didn't matter whether the priest was righteous or wicked. God acknowledged and honored the position or the stewardship that they held. The fact that God recognized the authority is evidenced in the following passage about Caiaphas, the high priest who presided over the council at Jesus' trial. And this to me is like a clincher. Okay, John 11:47 through 52. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, what are we to do? For this man performs many signs. And if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come, and they'll take away our place and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it's better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. He did not say this of his own accord, but being the high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. The priest who presided over the sham trial of God's Son was used as a prophet of God, simply because he held the position of the high priest. He held the stewardship of the high priest that year. Caiaphas prophesied that one man would die in the place of the people, that the life of one man would be sacrificed in order to save all of humanity. That's astounding to me. It's amazing to me to think about that. So I want to read one other excerpt about Caiaphas from gotquestions.org. Joseph Caiaphas was the Jewish high priest during the time of Jesus' ministry and a few years afterwards. He was a strong opponent of Jesus and his message. Caiaphas was the son-in-law of Annas, the former high priest, which may have accounted for his own rise to power. Caiaphas was also a member of one of the ruling Jewish sects, the Sadducees. The Sadducees were often wealthy men of high position, and as they sought to appease Roman rulers, they were heavily involved in politics. They held the majority seat in the Sanhedrin, the Jewish high court, over which Caiaphas ruled for the 18 years he served as high priest. In terms of theology, the Sadducees denied the afterlife, and any existence of the spiritual world, like angels and demons. Because of these things, they were often at odds with Jesus due to his teachings about humility, about heaven, and his own deity. After Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, both the Pharisees and the Sadducees met at Caiaphas's palace to express their concern that Jesus' growing number of followers would incite the anger of the Roman Empire. They were unsure how to proceed until Caiaphas spoke. "You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it's better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." This statement calling for Jesus' death was a cold, calculating move of political expediency. And at the same time, Caiaphas was unknowingly prophesying about God's plan for Jesus' death. Through the Sanhedrin's wicked actions, God would save both the Jewish nation and anyone else who would believe in Christ. I'll leave the link to that article in the show notes here. With very few exceptions, the history of the Jews demonstrates that worldly, immoral, and often godless men controlled the temple of God. And as an aside, a lot of people think that because of how the current state of Israel came into existence through the Rothschilds and other questionable people under rather questionable circumstances, that the current nation state of Israel could not have been an act of God. However, as we look at the way God's sovereignty is at work, the people that we see in Israel right now, though many of them may not be true Jews, many are. And this is how God is getting the real Israelites of God into the nation so that when the time comes, there's people there that he can lead into the wilderness. Actually, the current nation state of Israel will not survive to the second coming of Christ because it's part of the harlot system. So getting back to the priests who had the stewardship of all things religious, we know that at the time just prior to the Babylonian exile that the priests were engaging in terrible idolatry, very wicked practices. So on the one hand, they were going through all the motions that they needed to go through with regard to the rituals and so on. And at the same time, in secret, they were worshiping demons. And because God didn't judge it right away, they thought they were getting away with it. But eventually, what happens is sin reaches a limit, and God had Nebuchadnezzar come in, sack the temple, and remove the Jews into Babylon for 70 years, for a generation. And even though Caiaphas was an evil man, obviously a wicked person, didn't believe in an afterlife, that's crazy, didn't believe in the supernatural, didn't believe in angels or demons or anything like that, he was still God's delegated steward of the temple and anything and everything pertaining to the Jewish religious life in the first century. Okay, and this blows my mind. It really does. It's amazing to think about that God uses sinful men to bring about his purposes. Eventually, there's always a day of reckoning. There's a day when people have to give an account for their stewardship. You and I will have to appear before the judgment seat of Christ to give an account of our stewardship. The Pharisees and the scribes and the high priests will have to give an account for their stewardship. And there would be a day of reckoning that would come upon those Jewish leaders and the priests and so on in the first century because of their rejection and the way they crucified the Son of God. Okay, this is something that was prophesied in Daniel chapter 9. Jesus talked about it in Matthew 23 in the first part of 24, that someone would come in and tear that temple down. There wouldn't be one stone left standing upon another because they didn't know the time of their visitation. So there is a day of accounting and a day of reckoning. And for the Jewish leaders of Jesus' day, their day of reckoning came in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed the city and the temple, and the nation of Israel was dispersed. But God was not done with the nation of Israel. Paul tells us that God is not done with the nation of Israel, and neither was he finished with the prophecies that were encapsulated in those feasts of the Lord. The 7 celebrations which were tied to specific dates on the Hebrew calendar. We know Jesus died on the real Passover because nobody else had the authority. Nobody else had the stewardship. Okay, they were the ones that had it. The Essene community did not have the authority to revert the calendar back to another way. God never gave the Essenes the authority to do that. It was to these corrupt priests. They're the ones that had the authority and the stewardship of those things, as evidenced by the fact that Jesus died on their Passover, not the Passover of the Essenes or the Qumran community. So we know that Jesus died on Passover and that he's coming again. And his second coming is also tied to the feasts of the Lord because they're prophetic of his second coming. The Feast of Tabernacles, the Day of Atonement, all of these are prophetic and carry prophecies about God dwelling with men and Christ exiting the heavenly temple on a future day of atonement. I think it's safe to say that Jesus will fulfill other aspects of the prophecies on the day of those prophecies. So this is why it's important that we know what calendar to use, because here we are at the close of the age. And God has given us information so that we can know when to expect certain things to happen on his end time timeline. So how do we know what calendar to follow? Should we abandon the calendar that was in use in the first century and go over to a different one? Do we have the authority to change that? Should we go over to the Dead Sea calendar, the one that was followed by the Essenes? Is there another calendar that we should be using, like the one that calculates the beginning of the year by using signs of the zodiac? Are we supposed to use a full moon for the beginning of the months? How do we know what calendar to use? The Jews had this same problem. There needed to be some way for the Jews to know when to observe the feasts. Even in dispersion, the Jews have continuously celebrated the feasts of the Lord. They've observed them, though technically it's impossible to observe them apart from a temple because you need to do the sacrifices and so on. Like you can't sacrifice your Passover lamb at the temple if you don't have a temple. And most of the actual observances are tied to a temple. But the Jews still needed to be able to keep track of time, keep track of the seasons, the Moedim. And so here's the solution that they came up with. The Sanhedrin, which, remember, Caiaphas was the head of the Sanhedrin. He's the high priest, and they were the ones who were in charge of this group of 70 people. The Sanhedrin came up with a solution, a way for the Jews to calculate when the feast days would take place in the future. So here's another article from Got Questions. The Great Sanhedrin was the supreme court of ancient Israel, made up of 70 men and the high priest. In the Second Temple period, the Great Sanhedrin met in the temple in Jerusalem. The court convened every day except festivals and on the Sabbath. The Sanhedrin as a body claimed powers that lesser Jewish courts did not have. As such, they were the only ones who could try the king or extend the boundaries of the temple and Jerusalem, and were the ones to whom all questions of law were finally put. The last binding decision of the Sanhedrin was in 358 AD, when the Hebrew calendar was adopted. Okay, this was the last binding decision of the Sanhedrin, which had been continuing since the time of Christ. That's when the current Hebrew calendar was adopted. And this is the calendar that's still in use by the Jews today. So, what does this mean for us living in the last of the last days? What calendar is the right one to use when calculating the return of Christ and other events associated with the end times? Events which are prophetically prefigured in the feasts of the Lord. Well, if the first century Passover provides a meaningful example and pattern of Israel's assigned stewardship over the feast days and God's sovereignty over man, with Jesus' crucifixion taking place on the Passover, recognized by both Israel's leaders, who were corrupt, and God, as evidenced by the tearing of the veil in the temple, then we can expect that the calendar system standardized by the Sanhedrin in 358 AD, which was a continuation of the religious calendar in use during the first century, would continue to be the correct biblical Hebrew calendar. So the majority of Jews around the world observe the feasts on the days established centuries ago by those authorized by God to do so. The stewardship did not transfer to another group, whether to the more righteous Essenes or the followers of some other Jewish religious sect. Therefore, it's my opinion, and it's my opinion. You may have a different one, but it's my opinion that the current Jewish calendar that's being observed by Jews all over the world is most likely the calendar that God, in his sovereignty, has established for us to use during the end times. All right, so there's the reasons why I think that the current calendar is the one that we can use. And I think there is a biblical evidence for it, as evidenced by the fact that Jesus was crucified on the Passover that the Jewish leaders in Jesus' day observed it on, and the fact that God himself confirmed that by tearing the veil in two, by the signs in the sun, 3 hours of darkness, and by the earthquake that happened on that day. And the stewardship over the temple and the feasts and the calendar was never given to anyone else. It belonged to that group that held the priesthood. And then it would pass on to the next group of people who wore the garments. So even though there may have been priests in the Essene community, if they didn't wear the priestly garments, that they were unqualified. They had to have the uniform of it. Now, these are the dates that I use on my template, the feast days that are currently in use. That's my understanding of how this stuff works. So let me know what you think, and we'll see you on another video. Till then, have a blessed day.